Well, hello, everyone. Happy spring. It's me, Jon Oltsik, analyst in residence at theCUBE, cybersecurity community activist, and welcome again to another episode of the Cybersecurity Bridge podcast. If you've never, ever watched the Cybersecurity Bridge podcast, shame on you. But let me describe what I do here. So each episode, we look at a particular area of cybersecurity, and we break that into three parts. In the first part, we look at the present of that area of cybersecurity. And the second, we look at the future of that area of cybersecurity. And then the third is the cybersecurity bridge, how we get from the present to the future. And I've got another great guest here. So it is Vince Peeler, who is the CEO and one of the founders of Enlighten Intelligence. Vince, introduce yourself, because that introduction that I just gave is way understated.
Okay, well, thanks, John. Thanks for having me on. I always enjoy having these kinds of discussions, especially when we're talking about the future. But a little bit about my background. I'm a retired naval and intel officer. Electronic warfare is my background, information warfare. Then I led CTI teams at some large enterprises, such as Optum and Cargill, before going into more smaller organizations to do, CTI type work. And then, of course, I'm here now at Enlighten. I'm a co-founder here with my partner, Tim Pleasant. And, we're trying to bring CTI into, more organizations to be effective.
Which is an absolutely worthy but challenging goal.
Yeah.
And there's the expression, this guy wrote the book on this. You actually did. You wrote the book on cyber threat intelligence and threat intelligence and analysis. So people look for that book by Vince. It's great.
Oh.
It's very comprehensive.
Yeah, thanks, John. As my founder partner always says, Tim, that I always undersell what I do because I just forget. But yes, I actually wrote the book, The Intelligence Pyramid. And it's about how to, design, build, and mature CTI teams. And then also, I forgot to mention, I also teach this stuff at Metro State in St. Paul, Minnesota, whether it's intel strategically or cybersecurity and intel and threat hunting. So do a lot of education work as well.
And that's what we're going to talk about. But before we do, are you, Vince Peeler, ready to play cybersecurity trivia?
Oh, let's play, I guess.
All right. Well, and I have to read these because it's a little bit complex. So not complex, but as a cybersecurity or cyber threat intelligence expert, you're quite familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So the question is, what does that an acronym stand for? And is it A, advanced threat tactics, capabilities, and knowledge? B, automated threat tracking, categorization, and keyframes? C, adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge? D, adversarial threat vectors, countermeasures, and kinetics? Or E, analytical tactics, topographies, and cyber knowledge? And please don't ask me to read those again.
I think it's C.
You're absolutely correct. I figured you would get that, but I talked about MITRE ATT&CK all the time, and it took me to go look it up to remember what it stood for. So,
yeah, it's one of those things that you just start saying attack, and after a while you forget what the acronym stands for.
Exactly. So with that said, what general question I always ask my guests, what would you say the state of threat intelligence and threat intelligence analysis is in your experience?
Right now, I would say that people are struggling with CTI, the cyber threat intel space. People are kind of reverting back to IOCs. And I kind of somewhat disheartened by that because it's what people can do. They can automate it. They can, think they're doing something proactive with it. But I often say that IOCs are as good as the last person's attack. They don't do as much or forewarning about future state in attacks. That can be a little bit debated when you're talking about, the if the current campaign is ongoing, yeah, there'll be some overlap. But for the most part, it's kind of looking behind you and not looking forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. I did some research on this when I was at ESG. And so, and that's, we're down in the weeds of, and the basics of threat intelligence when we talk about IOCs. But, but we always talk about the bottom up looking at threat intelligence, but talk to me about the top down. So when you talk to CEOs, when you talk to CISOs and CIOs, how should they lead this program?
Well, first of all, you should understand why you have a program. Too often, I talk to organizations that have no idea why they have it. It's mostly, oh, we think we need to track threats. So, Intel team, here you go do Intel work. And that's not really effective because just like other parts of a business, you need to have some type of requirements for the team. There must be a vision, and what I like to talk about the leadership wise is why did you even create a team? What was your expectations? And let's turn those into requirements and business, things for the actual team to carry out. If you tell a team, go do Intel, and then there's no wonder why you get the feedback that it seems like it's too academic and people don't know what to do with the reporting. Because when I first started working in the Intel, in the CTI space, outside the military, they're like, go write Intel reports. Like, on what? I don't know. You're the Intel, go write reports. But I'm like, my background is mostly counterterrorism. I don't think you care about counterterrorism here, you know, and maybe you do, but probably not what we need to worry about. And so let's track things back to a requirement. And that is driven by leadership.
And so certainly the requirement should be that you want to protect business operations, you want to protect business assets, protect the reputation of the company. So if I said that to you as a leader and you're the threat intelligence analyst lead, how do you interpret that and how do you make that actionable?
Well, what I've been able to do in the past is kind of work with leaderships to define them more, really granularly, so we know exactly what. And here's, I think, is also I'm gonna. Now's probably a good time to talk about this. Is the dissemination piece of this? With that, like we can do the requirements and when we have that conversation, I want to talk also about who needs to know that information. Here's something that I've kind of picked up over the years is, Intel team writes a report, sends it shotguns it to everybody in the organization, and all you're doing is teaching a lot of the organization to ignore you because you become noise when you do that. So when I talk about requirements, I want to talk about who that requirement is tied to. And the other thing that we can discuss around that requirement and the dissemination, and I'll stop here in a second so I don't get too far down this topic, but to also think beyond a Word document or PDF. And so what else can you do with that data and what other formats does that need to be in? And all that does get centered into the requirements though. And I think that's too often ignored. And then you have this kind of generalized requirement where you don't really have who it's going to. And then you're actually, like I said, you're teaching the organization to ignore you.
And you make a great point there that it's not a generic threat report that you send out to everyone. You have to customize it for different constituents, line of business managers, CFOs, boards. And so is that a skill set that you teach, or is that something that you enlist feedback and then you internalize that and you improve over time, getting something more customized for each constituency?
Yeah. And I try and do that up front on it just because it helps you really kind of hone in on that requirement and what is it that that requirement needs to drive. Because typically it's going to be for a reason, like you said, a business line, other things in the past, and even with Enlighten in our system Thea, when we evaluate the intel, and part of it is, yeah, the ICDs or intelligence community directives for analytic standards, but we also look at the grade level of the report. We don't want to give a senior leader, a graduate level technical report because, you don't have time to read it and digest it. Now, if you're sending it to an engineering team, by all means, have at it. But those kinds of things. So it isn't just who and format, but more detail around that as well.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that we could spend 2 hours on anyway. But
Okay.
again, we go to that priority, the PIR, priority intelligence requirement, and you receive that as a threat intelligence analyst. How do you take that and then go through the life cycle and get back something, give that person back something that they need? I know that's a
Okay.
loaded question, but
That is a
go
loaded
ahead.
question. But really, it goes back to what I was just talking about. If you really have a well-defined requirement, you know exactly what they need. You know the format that they need it in. And I like to say that there's ways to write reports that are human consumable for different audiences, but there's also data feeds that you can pull out of those things. And we can talk about that and how that works later. I'm sure you'll have some questions around that as well. But that's what you do. So you really have. That's why I say you have to have well-defined requirements, so you know exactly what it is that they're looking for. Without that, you're kind of guessing, and that's why things I don't think hit home very often, because the analyst is left, if I can say that right, guessing on what the end user, the consumer of that intelligence is really looking for. So that's why I say you have to really well define that up front, so there's no real guesswork there, and it becomes useful then, especially if you have targeted dissemination. And real quick, I'll stop here. I've also found doing this work that I use my own method for it. So I call it the series method. Series one is all threat warning. Series two is leadership, decision support. Three is your general intel, and four is your environment at large. And you can kind of see a little bit there where those things are already prioritized by the series. And then within each uh, series is basically strategic, operational, and tactical. So that is kind of how that's laid out. So you know who needs it at what level, and that kind of helps break that out too. And that's what I found works. And having that conversation with leaders helps.
Yeah, I like the way we're just starting. We're not getting into the guts of threat intelligence, and obviously we don't have time, but we're taking a top-down approach. And too often, as you stated at the beginning, we start with IOCs, which is about as low as you can go. So
Right.
I like where we're going, but let's move on to the future. Now, I haven't come across this vendor yet, but I guarantee this vendor is out there that is saying, we really don't need threat intelligence analyst anymore. We just spin up some agents. They go out and they query or they know the business, they know the industry, they know the risks. They're going to go out and find the research. They're going to write the reports. Easy. So instead of having 5 threat intelligence analysts, maybe we need 1 orchestrator. What's right and wrong with that vision?
It kind of takes the human out of it, and how are you going to actually monitor that orchestrator and those agents? What we're finding from our own internal working at Enlighten really is it takes almost more human sometimes to get that AI to work right sometimes than it does just to turn them loose. Because there's still some human judgment that needs to play into that, at least for now. I mean, in the future that may change, and I'm sure it will slightly. But here's the other part. Right now, it seems like often leaders don't really know what to do with an intel report. So are they going to know what to do with it from an AI agent? No, it's going to take some real human. I mean, will the job of the analyst shift to be working with AI? That is our belief. That's will be the case, not replaced, but enhanced.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like I said, that vendor's out there and somehow they're raising money. So the VC
I'm
should
sure.
talk to you first. But um, I just was reviewing the new Verizon DBIR that came out, and it talked about the closing of the window. So the window between vulnerability discovery and exploitation is closing very, very rapidly. So what does that do to a threat intelligence program?
That actually, in some ways I think can help a CTI program, because just because you're closing that doesn't mean there's not new ones. And I think the attacks, I mean, what we saw recently with finding all the vulnerabilities that've been out for 20 years, that still needs to be reported. Those things are still going to be found. There's things being developed every day, so there's new vulnerabilities, you could argue, every day. So I don't think it's changing. This gets into what I refer to as the speed of attack, though. And some of that discussion, it's tangential but very similar. And that's where I think AI will help us out, is being able to operate at that speed of the adversary, the speed of their attack. As they use AI, we'll have to use AI back. But there still needs to be kind of that human judgment that AI still has trouble with.
Yeah, absolutely. It does add, to me, it adds a sense of urgency. So if you haven't built a good threat intelligence program, if you don't have a threat-informed defense, now's the time. Are you seeing that in the market? Are you seeing more urgency from customers and prospects?
I don't know if it's urgency is the thing. I think right now people are almost apprehensive because they don't know where things are headed. They haven't fully understood AI. They haven't fully implemented it. They often don't trust AI. We're seeing that. I mean, let's face it. A lot of the vendors that use AI have it in a black box, and you don't really get to monitor what the AI is actually doing or how it's doing. And that's one of the things that we've taken seriously, at Enlighten, as we build out our AI and our agents and stuff, is really trying to give the user, the customer, full visibility on how it operates, and helping them monitor for drift and things like that and hallucinations. We're still trying to work all that out, right now, but that's where, we're talking about the future. That's where I think we're going to have to go. Otherwise, it goes back to what we were all taught way back when, garbage in, garbage out. But if you don't really know what's going in, how do you trust it coming out?
I've seen so many threat intelligence programs that are garbage in, garbage out, and I wrote about this probably 4 or 5 years ago, and it's still true. It just
Yeah.
amazes me. Um, but I mean, one of the things, if you kind of a best practice is to go from reactive to proactive, and so reactive, getting IOCs, waiting for attacks. Proactive, anticipating attacks, understanding what the threat actors are doing. Are you seeing that? Or how do we do that in the future? From a technology standpoint, but also organizational and process.
Right. Organizations have to, well, one, understand this a little bit more, especially in the CTI realm of this. I wrote about this in my book, where really, when you get into threat modeling, AI can really help us here. And that is run these attacks, not just your typical red team or your attack simulations. Yes, but for specific adversaries that you're looking at, constantly at scale with slight adjustments, but also monitoring on the backside, what these attacks look like in your own network, and being able to come up with that, and then using, now I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of one of my tangents here, but it's really going off into, when you understand the attack and what it looks like, you can start to do like one off, and you can go off and then look for what the attack looks like. But also with AI, you can look for what, like the weak signals of an impending attack. Now that you understand what they are, you can sit back and kind of monitor for them. So now you're ahead of an attack, and you can look for that. And that's where I think AI can help us, is looking for things that we don't necessarily see right away. Humans are not good at that, the weak signals, putting together some of that. So that's where definitely AI can help. There's some other things about analysis that maybe we'll get into in a bit, where AI can help us out.
Well, let's get right into it, because I was going to ask you about this. The pyramid of pain is a pretty useful model for threat intelligence analysts. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a hierarchical model that starts at sort of the lowest level of threat intelligence and climbs to the highest, with the thought of the higher you go, the more disruptive you are of the adversary's attack methods, the more it costs them and the more work is involved in attacking you. It seems to me that AI can help there by, like you said, stringing together some of the weak signals, making some postulations about how those things relate to TTPs or to MITRE attack segments. So am I right there, or am I just kind of drinking the Kool-Aid?
No, that's kind of what I think will happen in the future with AI and where we can go. Not just that, and maybe that's a good time that I can kind of get this out. I've been writing a white paper. I haven't produced it yet, so first time it's being known more publicly on if you're into intelligence, tradecraft, and analysis, you probably understand structured analytic techniques, and that's to help humans do things like eliminate bias and those kinds of things. But I'm running on kind of to go along with that, and augmented analytic techniques where AI is working with you. And why that is important is we're bringing, very complex analytic tradecraft into, the average analyst, and, sometimes we talk about, we're bringing the three-letter agency tradecraft, to the average analyst user in a corporate environment. And, and it's really those techniques that you can get into. A lot of those are quantitative type techniques. And we were kind of already discussing around that, and, in the last little discussion about where that kind of goes as far as tracking adversaries. But it also goes into preparing to understand what the attacks would look like. So I'll stop there for right now.
Well, I look forward to that white paper. So let me know, and I'll let our audience know how to find it when it's ready. But
Okay,
let's
great.
move on. Let's move on to the cybersecurity bridge, how we get from the present to the future. So first, and this is sort of related to that, but every threat intelligence analyst that I've met, that I like you, that I really pay attention to, I feel like they have a lot of wisdom, has a military or intelligence background. So if someone wants to get into this space and they don't have that background, are there I know you're teaching, so probably take your class, but aside from that, what would you recommend?
Pretty much that is, I would start off, yeah, you'd have to know some cyber stuff. So you're going to need to know that, but take traditional intelligence courses. Cyber intelligence courses oftentimes revert back to cybersecurity, discussions, where I would get into, other types of like traditional intel analysis. And you can find those courses in more and more in a lot of different colleges. And you can see that because that's going to teach you the true analytic methods, whereas CTI teaches you typically not those. I mean, there are some courses, I haven't taken them, so I don't know for a fact, but it looked like they do touch on some of that traditional. And oftentimes those people teaching those courses do come from the government. I mean, when I teach more under the cyber banner than the intelligence banner at Metro, it is definitely more cyber focused. Where when I do other intel courses, I typically do more geopolitical just to give a mix of that. And I think that would be very beneficial. And of course, understand that intelligence is about your own thinking as well. I mean, there's some historical, well, I'll say historical books, but things like this, psychology of intel analysis and things that came out of, the government. There's a lot, luckily the government publishes a lot of different things like that you can get for free and kind of teach yourself.
Yes, and in my conversations with those threat intelligence analysts, they've explained to me that threat intelligence doesn't, when you take it outside of the cyber domain, it really speaks to things like confidence levels and reporting structures and things like that. And with that, we've talked a lot about technology, which is kind of my background, but what has to change in terms of processes, leadership, things like that as we move forward, even as we adopt AI tools? But clearly, there's way more to this than just the technology.
Yes, there is. It's really, and the way that we break it down, and in fact, we built our whole Thea platform. It's an Intel management platform around the organization, the people, the processes, which unsurprisingly probably is the Intel cycle, the technology, and then the governance. So that's the model that's baked into it. I think if you just jump into, let me just kind of write reports and push that data out without fully understanding everything else, it's going to fall flat. And I think that's why we're seeing it kind of fall flat a lot right now. And people are asking themselves, what ROI are we actually getting from CTI? And I think that's why, because you haven't fully defined and managed the whole process and the whole, the whole program.
Yeah, what I hear you saying, Vince, is before you do anything, take a step back. What do you want to
Yeah.
do with this? Who's involved? How are we going to manage this cycle and make sure that there's continuous improvement? And with that, so what's the responsibility of the consumers of threat intelligence in terms of feedback and making sure that they get what they need rather than ignoring what they get?
And thank you for that, because that is really a critical piece that is often overlooked. And that is, did that report or whatever you got hit the mark? If it didn't, don't just say, oh, that was useless and go move on with your day. Inform the team so they can make it better, more useful. You need that feedback loop. And even in the government, that was very difficult to get, by the way. So I'm not surprised that, corporations struggle with that same process. And that's some of the reasons why we try to do other ways of tracking actions taken by those reports, just as a way to track some of that feedback, even though it's not as good as, reporting back and having those discussions. One of the things that you can do to help with some of that is, the requirements that we talked about at the beginning they're not just set and left and forgotten about. You have to evolve those over time, and having conversations with those consumers and the stakeholders of the program is really critical. And really, if you can get that kind of work to happen, that is a great thing when it does, because it really feeds back and makes your program even better. If you're guessing, you're probably not going to guess right. So I know I took it as a real success at one of the companies I was at, when on a morning call about threats and about some of the things that were happening, the CISO actually stopped and said, "What does Intel think?" To me, that was a huge win. That meant that we had actually, proven ourselves, and it took a while to get there. It took a long while. So that should be every CTI managers and directors like wish, is to have senior leadership ask, "What does Intel think?" Because I hadn't had that happen since I left the government service. So
Yeah, that's a good pat on the back. Um, so the military talks about getting left of boom. And it would seem to me that modern board members, boards of directors, would want to get left of boom. And so are you seeing board level interest in threat intelligence? And maybe that's the motivation to get it to mature the program within the organization.
what I'm seeing is, yes, they want information about it. Most of the time, what I've seen is they want a lot of information around ransomware, because that has scared everybody, um, and rightfully so. But that begins those conversations. I haven't seen or haven't really dealt with any board members that go, "Hey, I want more intel on something." They say, "Hey, we recognize like ransomware is our big threat." This was especially critical when I was in the healthcare field. You know, the board members, I mean, because their healthcare is targeted all the time. I mean, look at Change Healthcare last year, um, or was it the year before? I mean, my timing is getting, everything is moving very fast. But Yeah, so that became a big deal. And using that to help drive okay, we can answer those questions. We can do it with a CTI program, but we need, to be linked up.
So they need to, it's a good thing that they're asking, but they need to broaden and think about threats at large versus just ransomware, which, as you
Yes,
point out, healthcare, state and local government, academic or education, yeah, they've been hit hard, but you need a
yeah,
broader perspective.
correct. But the ransomware discussion can kind of help that discussion a little bit, as far as that goes. So you know, that's always good to having stakeholders and especially senior leaders ask questions, because then it allows you to kind of shine a little bit and have them ask, well, if you can answer that, can you answer this? So, you know, don't don't just answer a question and then move on. Is there anything else that we can help answer? Try and push and prod a little bit. Because the more you do that, the more they understand that, that you can answer those, the more questions you'll get, and then the more engagement you end up with.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking if you're a board member and you get the report on ransomware, you should be thinking, okay, but Intel, what else should we be concerned about? And one of those things I'm wondering is geopolitical. I mean, the world is not in the safest, most peaceful and harmonious time. And so how do you, as a threat analyst or maybe consulting with executives and boards, how do you recommend that they look at the geopolitical situation from a threat intelligence perspective?
Yes, and that's one of the things I think lately that has been driving things a little bit more, especially with the Straits of Hormuz situation that is occurring. I mean, especially if you're in shipping right now, or the whole industry, that's going to be you know top of mind and how that's going to affect things. But it isn't just the movement of oil through the straits. It's what cyber events, what information warfare stuff is going on. Branding and those kinds of things can take a hit in this kind of realm as well. And you see the same things in the Ukraine war. I mean, that started some of this kind of discussions. You know, Russia, for instance, they co-opt the criminal groups. I mean, that's been the assessment, at least, not just from me, but from a lot of others in the cyber intel world. And, just tracking, how does that play out? How does, a geopolitical statement from, an administration in the US about funding some opposition to another foreign state create attacks? And what's that time frame? What does that look like? Just so being able to track that, as well as the latest malware variant, is also critical.
Yeah, and I'll ask one more question because we're almost out of time. But does your domain include misinformation? So, for instance, you're in healthcare and there's misinformation about the Ebola virus, or you're traveling and there's misinformation about the Ebola virus. Do you is your recommendation that the threat intelligence program include that?
It would, again, depend on the organization. But what I have found in a lot of the corporate environments is there's a limited intel. Often the CTI team is the only intel organization in the company. So it would kind of fall on that team. And that's where, having a CTI team that's not tied to a SOC function solely is beneficial, because you can answer those questions. And oftentimes you kind of want to drop the C out of, CTI, just because there's so much overlap in what the military, the government calls multi-domain warfare, or multi-domain type intelligence. If you want to, talk on that aspect of it, that they're interrelated. Physical and cyber overrelate. And we kind of known that. We've seen that with like ATM hijacking and those kinds of things. But there's other things when you talk about geopolitical and cyber and physical. It all overlaps a lot. And one of the things that I made sure that we did in Thea, the platform, when we do have analytic tools, was do a timeline analysis tool with multi-domain, so you can see how those things line up. So Yeah, I do think a CTI team is probably the right place in most organizations. It doesn't. Some companies have more of a physical intel team too, so it could be a play out between those two. But in a lot of places, there's only one intel team, and it's the CTI team.
I've seen some of these peripheral areas driving threat intelligence programs like executive protection, brand reputation, web application monitoring, all those. And sometimes they call that digital risk prevention, but if that drives a better threat intelligence program, that's great.
Mhm.
Vince, boy, could I talk to you all day. I love this stuff, and hopefully the audience
I do
is getting
too.
a lot out of it. We're kind of out of time. Well, we're not kind. We're out of time, but I want to ask you one last question that I ask every one of my guests, and that is, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to organizations, CISOs, cyber security professionals, even business executives? What would that be?
You do need to understand the threats, and the biggest advice is determine what it is that you really want to know before you set up a CTI team. Otherwise, they're not going to succeed. You're setting them up for failure. So understand that intelligence is also a journey. You don't start off with a high-end analytic team. That's built over time. Even if you hire some very sophisticated analysts, it's still CTI is an organizational function. So the organization has to be mature enough to accept those kinds of analysis as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I would add, it's CTI is a conversation and it's a resource. So uh, risk and threats change, and so these conversations need to be ongoing. And don't be afraid to ask the threat intelligence teams what they think of a certain threat, even if it's outside of the domain, because they're trained, or they should be trained, to have that expertise to analyze it. So, Vince, thank you so much. You're a great guest. I really appreciate it. Again, tell us, you're in Enlighten Intelligence, and you wrote the book. What's the name of the book again for our audience?
The intelligence pyramid.
Okay, great. And we look forward to seeing you and the great things you're doing with Enlighten Intelligence. So again, thank you. And for my audience, thank you for watching, and stay tuned in another couple of weeks for the next episode of the Cybersecurity Bridge podcast. Thanks, Vince.
Thanks, John.